So, if you are a parent, you may have heard as your child gets older, the gap increases between what your child is doing and what the other students are doing in the class. And the educators might be suggesting that your child spend more time in the special education room. Or if you're an educator, it might be that it's frustrating to figure out exactly how to effectively include students in your classroom. Today, our focus is going to be how to advocate for that inclusion. We'll talk give some tips of some examples, but mainly we're going to be focusing on the advocacy part for inclusion. And so that pertains to students, to parents, to teachers, right? If you have not joined on one of our live shows before, I am Charmaine Tanner. I'm a retired special educator, general educator. We have an adult son, Dylan, who happens to have Down syndrome. And now I am a full-time advocate for other families and students. And I'm so excited because we have a special guest with us today. Ricki is here with us. She is the Senior Education Policy Advisor for the National Down Syndrome Congress. She also is a parent of a son with Down syndrome. So she knows what it's like to be in those parent trenches and what it's like to be on a certain side, often, right, of an IEP table. But Ricki Sabia is here, and I am so excited because she has recently been writing some very valuable briefs, some information for parents and educators from the TIES Center. So Ricki, welcome. I don't know if you'd like to add some other things about yourself before we jump in.
No, just reiterate that I do come to this as a parent. My son is 28 years old. By some miracle, we managed to keep him included throughout school. I say miracle because, as we'll talk about today, no matter how good an advocate you are or how much you know the law, we all know how many struggles there are to make that happen, and especially back then. I will say that he is now living independently in an apartment and working at a local hospital. So, it's all worked out well, and I really feel inclusion is a lot to thank for that. I came to this TIES work as parent liaison for that center, in addition to my role as senior policy advisor for the National Down Syndrome Congress. I'm very excited about this because my two passions, universal design for learning and inclusive education, come together in this project. And I really have hopes that we'll be able to, through this project, work on top-down systemic change from the state down, and also bottom-up with resources for educators and parents.
Yeah, so it is so exciting. And I want to share the website for TIES. So later you can go and check out all the wonderful resources. Ricki's going to give us an overview, and then we're going to get more specific on certain topics. But let's go. We have a couple slides just to give you the feel for the TIES Center. So let me bring up our slide here.
Okay, so the reason for having this slide is I wanted to make sure you were able to go and get more information, because there's only obviously so much we can cover. I'm talking mostly about 3 parent briefs that we've done so far, but there are so many more resources. There's a parent tab, an educator tab, a state systemic change tab, and there's so many resources under each of those tabs. So tiecenter.org. Also, if you follow them on Facebook, that would be great because they post a lot of great information on their Facebook page. And when new resources are posted, you will be able to find it out that way. And then I also provide you with their email address because we're always looking for suggestions on what else might be needed. And that will be, that's part of what we're doing, is trying to figure out, what other parent resources are needed. I also provide you with my information and the Facebook page for the NDSC Policy and Advocacy team because I post a lot of updates about ties and other stuff having to do with education policy and policy across the lifespan on that Facebook page as well.
Great. So let's look here to see exactly what ties, what that stands for.
So this is really important because inclusion is not just a seat in that classroom. I think we all know that. The only thing worse than being segregated is just having a seat with no meaningful engagement in the curriculum or in the classroom. So the T for ties does stand for increasing the time, but there's also instructional effectiveness, engagement, and also state support for inclusive practices, that these elements have to come together if we're going to have real meaningful inclusion for students with significant cognitive disabilities in a systemic way.
Right. And these are some of the partners with ties.
And this is why I say I'm excited. CAST is one of the partners, and CAST is the organization that developed the principles of universal design for learning. So that's a big piece. And then we have these other partners, a lot of them that provide the instructional support and the materials that I don't do because I come from a policy perspective, but will provide a lot of materials for how do educators do this, tips documents and other documents which will help educators know how to do this.
Cool.
And this is the why for the TIE Center, and the TIE Center's formal name is the Center for Inclusive Practices and Policies for Students with Significant Cognitive Disabilities. And the reason it's so important is you can see on the one side the percentage of all students who are included, which is still not great, but it's still a very high percentage compared, if you look at the right side, at the different IDA categories and students who have intellectual disabilities being 17%, which is not on this, but I'm telling you it's 17% for students with intellectual disabilities, but they don't collect data on students who take alternate assessments. But another project, a lot of the same folks were on this NCSIC, National Center and State Collaborative Project, some years ago, and they did a study in 2015 of 18 states, I believe, and 40,000 students, and determined that only 3% of students who are considered those with the most significant cognitive disabilities who take alternate assessment were in general education classrooms, which is abhorrent. And armed with this study and working for NDSC, I went all over the Department of Education waving this study around, saying, you know, something has to happen with this, because everybody would just say, well, you know, almost 70% of students with disabilities are included. And I'm like, 3% of this population, that is out and out discrimination. And so, you know, from this study came this center and the need and the acknowledgement to focus on this population, which in and of itself is very important advocacy tool for parents. Because for any educators or school districts who think that the federal law doesn't mean these students, here's the federal government putting millions of dollars into a center saying, let's fix this problem for kids who are considered kids with significant cognitive disabilities. And those students are students who take alternate assessments. But even if your student does not take alternate assessments yet, or maybe never will take alternate assessments, the fact that these rules we'll talk about here today apply to these students makes it extra that they should be applying to any student who's taking the general assessment. So, you know, even if your student doesn't take the alternate assessment at this point or never will, this is still, you will still recognize arguments that are used against inclusion for your child.
Oh, I bet. And I wanted to welcome all our live viewers. And if you're watching on the replay, and let you know, if you type TIES, TIES, in the chat box, that hopefully my IEP bot is awake and will respond and get you set up. So we will send you additional resources too. And I'm going to take a quick look at here because we might have some questions coming in. Kimberly from Iowa is here. Hey, Kimberly. Heather is here from Florida. So and Courtney, you know Courtney Ricki, she's watching
Yes.
from
Yeah,
Washington.
Courtney. I know Courtney, yes.
So yes, so as you think of your questions, just go ahead and type them in. We will be, you know, pausing and answering questions, and then also at the end. But go ahead and let us know what your thoughts and questions are. So as we go through some of the TIE resources, you can see, you know, some of the things that are available. And Ricki, you had said that there's been 3 briefs that you have co-authored right now.
So far, yeah. And the 4th one coming, which I'll mention, and we're going to be doing more. I just want to say before we get to the briefs that if you go onto these different headings in the TIE Center website, you will find a lot of important things that are not just these briefs. There are a whole bunch of articles that provide research on inclusion, that provide, you know, examples on inclusive settings, that if you go to the bottom of the educator tab, there are some resources from that center I mentioned before that predated this one, the NICSIC, Alternate Assessment Center, where they had developed not just an alternate assessment, but resources to help teachers educate students on grade level aligned content and get them as far as they can go, because students who take an alternate assessment are a very wide range of abilities and needs. And so, and if you click on the all resources side of that page, you can see the variety of different resources there are that help educators, and they're free. Now, they're a little dense, but part of what TIES is doing is going back and trying to make them more accessible, but there were a ton of resources that are free on, you know, how do you take grade level aligned curriculum and make it work for individual students. And that doesn't mean an alternate curriculum. That means having examples on how you take the grade level curriculum, modify, use accommodations, use alternate and adapted materials, and get each student as far as they can go on the grade level content.
Right. So I really encourage people to be able to take some time out to check out these resources. And like I said, we'll be sending them and posting some of the specific ones in the comments today that were, there's 3 particular briefs that we're going to be talking about a little bit today. So do you want to talk about that first one, Ricki?
Sure. I'll start with the first one we did is the 10 reasons to support inclusive school communities for all students. And this is the conversation starter. This is the why. And it's, I would so hope at this point, with my son being 28, we would be past the why, but we all know we're not past the why. So this gets into 10 reasons why this is important. And it's this one's an interactive document. And I want to say, if you go on these pages, there is a login box at the bottom of these pages. I do not know why. You do not have to log in. All you have to do is click on the name of the resource, and you can either get into it or it'll give you an opportunity to download it. This particular one is an interactive one, which you can either download or you can go right on it on the website. And then there are each of these reasons. And then for these reasons, there are some live videos that you can click on. It's interactive. And also I want to say in development is a facilitator, a discussion facilitator guide. So this is something that maybe schools could have a conversation about with a facilitated guide with questions to spark conversation. But, you know, some of these, and we as parents, we know this stuff. You know, some of these reasons are support of civil rights, integration into community living, varied learning opportunities, use of best practices in instruction, relationships with peers, parent involvement. Because if our son or daughter is at our neighborhood school, we're going to be a lot more involved than if we have to drive 45 minutes and it's not to school our other kids attend. So there's 10 reasons with some text around each of these reasons. And like I say, links to other resources and videos, and there will be this facilitator guide. It has not been completed yet. So that was the first one. This was the why. So then from there, we wanted to start getting into busting some of the myths. And one of the big ones, I think, And again, maybe your student doesn't take the alternate assessment, but any person who does have a student who takes an alternate assessment knows, and I face this with my son, the minute you say okay to that alternate assessment, the first thing they say is, well, then we really need him or her to be in a special education classroom. And then they have a whole bunch of reasons why that's necessary. And right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about this resource, which helps hopefully bust some of those myths and explains to educators and families what the law actually says. So there's nothing in the least restrictive environment provisions of IDA that says a darn thing about what kind of assessment you take or what kind of disability you have. It just says that you cannot be removed from the general education classroom unless the student cannot be satisfactorily educated there, even with supplementary aids and services. So even with, only if, these are legal presumptions. It means that the first place you're supposed to talk about in that IEP meeting is that general education classroom. And the fact that they take an alternate assessment, or the fact that they need a behavior plan, or their IQ, or a million other things is not part of the LRE language. And so it's very important to know that. In addition, with the alternate assessment, there's also another important thing under IDA that I post about 1 million times every week is IDA regulation 300.116E. I have it memorized. That says that you cannot remove a student from an age-appropriate general education classroom solely because of needed modifications to the curriculum. So right there, it's telling you, just because a student needs less complex curriculum, maybe adapted materials, modifications, not just accommodations, but going beyond that to modifications, does not mean you can remove the child from the general education classroom. So this idea that the child has to do everything that everybody else does in the way that everybody else does it is clear violation of this regulation. So that's a big one I throw around all the time. So also the Every Student Succeeds Act is very important in this conversation, which a lot of people don't realize. And we worked really hard to advocate at NVSC for improved provisions in the Every Student Succeed Act, because they specifically had language before that was kind of negative for students who take alternate assessments, like they will have access to the curriculum to the extent possible. And we're like, well, what's that about? That's not very helpful. So we went in there with ASSA and we advocated and got very strong language about that they are to be included in and make progress in the general ed curriculum for the grade in which they're enrolled. None of this to the extent possible. That states cannot preclude a student who takes an alternate assessment from attempting to meet the requirements of a regular high school diploma. So this idea that in 3rd grade, if you take an alternate assessment, we now take you off diploma track, that is also in violation of ESSA. And that's a very common thing that's stated, but it's very clear. This provision is specifically for kids who take an alternate assessment. So clearly it means kids who need modifications, because by definition, kids who take alternate assessments need modifications. So we've got 21 plus years to earn a regular diploma. No one can say what those requirements will even be by the time your child gets to graduation. So ultimately there may be a decision to make, but it should not be in the early grades. Another one is that if a student meets the alternate achievement standards on these alternate assessments, they should be prepared to pursue post-secondary education and competitive integrated employment. So that shows that these standards for achievement on these assessments should not be very low, because otherwise, how are they going to help students pursue post-secondary education and competitive integrated employment? There's also language in there about the same academic standards for all students. And this gets very complicated, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later. But an alternate assessment is on alternate achievement standards. Now, the achievement standards are what's alternate. How much mastery there needs to be, how complex, how much depth, how much breadth is expected on that assessment to be proficient. But the content standards the law says have to be the same as for all students. Now, that doesn't mean they have to master everything in the same way. You still got your adapted materials, your modifications, your adaptations, but it should be aligned to that same grade level content. None of this teaching, second grade curriculum to a 10th grader, so therefore we can't include them. You need to take that 10th grade lesson, find the essential understandings, figure out a way to adapt it so that they can work on that. And I can give you an example of that. For example, if there's a lesson in geometry and the geometry problem is for a student to figure out, Sarah has this size closet and wants this size closet, how much more area needs to be added to the closet to make it work? Well, I've seen this problem, done in usual geometric form. I've seen the problem be written out for the student and the student uses a calculator to solve it. I've also seen it done on graph paper where here's the closet, here's the space where it needs to be added, and by counting up the squares for a student who is working on one-to-one correspondence, they can answer that same question. So there are ways to do it, and this is an example from those NCSIC material that really can help teachers get an idea. So those are some examples. Another thing in ASSA is it says that all educators, including general educators, are supposed to be trained to administer the alternate assessment. So this idea that, if you're taking an alternate assessment, you have to be in that classroom with those teachers because they have to administer the alternate assessment, that also does not fly with what the law says. So, if your district is not also training general educators on how to administer this assessment, that's a problem. And I know we faced this where they wanted to pull my son out to do it, the alternate assessment. I'm like, you can do it when the other kids are taking their regular assessment. You can, if they're using a portfolio, you can take examples of his work from day to day. You don't need to be putting him in another class to be working on this. So those are the legal provisions behind it. There's also in this brief, there are some other info on concepts like least dangerous assumption, that if you're going to make an assumption about a student, you make one that's going to do the least harm to them as opposed to the usual assumption, which is they can't do it. And also it talks about next steps that parents can take, about communication supports, about providing resources to educators. And then there is a resource section at the end. So it's a very short brief, it's 4 pages, but it's a good thing to kind of wave around if one of the things you're facing is this idea that, they're taking the alternate assessment, they can't be in the regular class.
Well, and the other thing I think too is so many times we focus on IDEA as advocates, parents, educators, and we forget about the Every Student Succeeds Act and the important components in there that parents can use and educators can use when they're advocating for inclusion too.
It's very important, and we at NDSC have been pushing this a lot because parents, like right away, if something happens with IDA, they are all over it. But weakening of Every Student Succeeds Act, or their states can have, they're only supposed to put 1% of all students in alternate assessment, which equals about 10% of students with disabilities, which is already way too big, can include every student with Down syndrome. But then states were allowed to get waivers and have more than those kids. And, we try, Candace Cordiella of the Advocacy Institute and I, when these waivers were coming out, to engage families, engage parent centers in speaking up about these waivers in their state. And we had a really hard time with that. You can find out under the Advocacy Institute website, she's got an alternate assessment page, which you can look up your state and see if they have a waiver. And what are they promising? They're supposed to be bringing down the percent of the kids they're putting in these assessments. Hi, Candace. They're supposed to be doing things to bring down the percentage of students they're putting in these assessments. So what are they promising, and are they doing it? And that's something parents can be engaged in.
Yes, and I would second that motion to check out the Advocacy Institute. I know Candace has been a guest on our show and was talking about state complaints, but there is a wealth of information at the Advocacy Institute website. So that's an excellent resource that you can also tap into.
And a lot of materials around the Every Student Succeeds Act. And I can't impress enough that that's so important, what your state plan is for that. And because we always go around saying our students are regular education, general education students first. Well, that law is a law for all students, including students with disabilities. It specifically looks at, disaggregates data for students who have disabilities, and it raises the bar really in a lot of ways for IDEA, because free appropriate public education really needs to be read in the context of the promise of ESSA, which is a fair, equitable, and high quality education for all students. So if we're part of ESSA, then FAPE shouldn't be as low a bar as it sometimes can be considered. You know, we shouldn't have to be afraid to say high quality when it comes to our students, like often happens in IEP meetings.
That's an excellent tip, I think, for parents to take.
So that's a good segue, if there aren't questions, into the Developing IEPs resource. Do we have questions on the other one?
We had a couple, so let me see. And you might answer this one in the next brief, but Angela was saying, where do I find out about modifying material to the core standards for each grade? That she missed that.
Okay, well, there are some resources, curriculum and instructional resources from that other center I talked about, NICSIC. N is in Nancy, C is in Charles, S is in Sam, C is in Charles, Wiki. You can look that up in your browser, or you can go under those element cards that are under the educator resources I told you about on the TIES website, and then click on all resources. But there are a lot of examples there on what general education UDL lessons look like. It's not going to cover every single thing, but they have what they call core content connectors, which take the core content standards and then break them down into smaller achievable pieces for students with significant cognitive disabilities. There's a lot of information that can, give some ideas about that. But the TIES website is also going to be has some resources for educators and tips, but also are going to be working on things like what they call the 5:15:45, which is how do you modify a lesson with 5 minutes, if you have 15 minutes, if you have 45 minutes. So there are going to be a lot of more the how-to resources in terms of actually, getting to those standards for students who are taking these assessments or, who have cognitive disabilities.
Oh, great. That'll be really helpful. So yeah, why don't we go to the third brief, because I know lots of parents are looking at ways that they can embed inclusion into other sections of the IEP and not waiting till you talk about the least restrictive environment. So your third brief, I know, is really packed with lots of good, valuable tips and strategies and resources.
Right. So it'll be somewhat general that what I can cover here. I encourage you to look at the brief, but I will try to cover some really salient points that I think are helpful. The brief starts out talking again about LRE, because every one of these things, that's what that's about. And one point I thought was really important, because I try to pay a lot of attention to what parents are being told. And so I encourage you to let TIES know, if you're being told some weird thing that we haven't talked about. But I've heard from a lot of people that they're being told that having an aide in the general education classroom makes it the most restrictive placement, which is nonsense, because restrictiveness is about time with non-disabled peers. So the less time you have with non-disabled peers, the more restrictive the setting. Therefore, that's why the first place to be considered always, and the ultimate least restrictive environment, is the general education classroom, because that's where the student is going to spend the most time with non-disabled peers. It does not refer to how much support, including an aide, that you may need to have in order to access that time with non-disabled peers. So where that came from, I have no idea, but restrictiveness has nothing to do with the support. It has to do with the amount of time with non-disabled peers. And of course, the general education classroom is the place that is the least restrictive. And, you know, there are families who feel that even with supplementary aids and services, even with everybody doing everything as well as they can, that for their student, in part maybe because the system is not where it should be, that they can't be in a regular education classroom. I think if things are done well, that should be exceedingly rare. But if you do then go on to look at other settings, LRE should still apply. It isn't like, oh, okay, general education classroom is not going to work, so we're just going to go to a separate school. You know, there is a continuum. And so being in that general education class most of the time with maybe some pullout, being in the general education and special education classroom, being in, and it should go in the smallest increments possible away from time with same age general education peers, because LRE covers the use of that whole continuum, but always start in the general education classroom. And there should be the use of supplementary aids and services. And there's a whole list of things that fall under that. I mean, in some places, aids fall under that. In some places, it falls under support for educators. But you know, the adapted materials your student may need. I mean, I put in my son's IEP because they didn't know what UDL was at the time, and I wanted them to use UDL. So I was putting in things like adapted materials, lower reading level text, movie versions of novels, No Fear Shakespeare that had the regular English, you know, anything I could think of, and that so that they would be putting them in supplementary aids and services, that you're supposed to use these things. Don't just say he can't do it if you're just sitting him in that chair, giving him the same book as everybody else, which is not good educational practice anyway, and then saying, oh, look, he can't do it. So supplementary aids and services, that's supposed to happen. It's not supposed to be, we don't give you those, but he or she can't do it, so off you go to some other setting. There's also that I already talked about the IDA regulation about that needed modifications are not a reason to remove a child from the general education classroom. That's a very important one. It's important to know that the LRE provisions apply to extracurricular activities as well, and transition and employment activities while a student is in school. When Charmaine started this out, she talked about the gap. You know, how you're told, oh, the gap is getting bigger. You know, we were told, you know, oh, well, maybe in second grade this will work, but then they're going to get to third grade, and then he's going to get to fifth grade. And each time we had to show, no, we can still do this. This is how. And there was a relatively recent circuit court case, LH versus Hamilton County. It was about a child with Down syndrome who was in a separate class with an alternate curriculum. And one of the things the court said as part of this decision was that the student does not have to master the general ed curriculum, but the IEP goals and the instruction must be aligned to the grade level content. So, you know, that's very important. That doesn't mean that they're going to master everything and do it all in the same way. And honestly, no student, my older son's a fifth grade general education teacher, and he doesn't have his other kids doing everything in the same exact way. So, because there are students who are English learners, there are, you know, and a lot of the resources, and this is why UDL is so important. If you have English learners who have vocabulary needs, and you have a student with a significant cognitive disability who has vocabulary needs, you could be using pictorial vocabulary resources for both of them, even though the student who's an English learner might, you know, be a gifted student. Their need is the same when it comes to vocabulary. So, you know, they shouldn't be doing the same thing for everybody anyway. So that's a big piece of it.
Michelle had a question about if you could talk a little bit more about LRE and extracurricular, because I think oftentimes that doesn't get discussed at all at IEP meetings.
Well, that's part of the law. It says in the law that LRE applies to extracurricular activities and in the regulations. And so, you know, one of the things that might be needed is some supports to be able to access the extracurricular activities. I mean, this is my personal viewpoint. I mean, I never felt that my son, if it was something that you had to go out competitively for and he could not compete competitively, like make the football team, I was not going to say you have to make him the quarterback. But if there's some role that he could play that somebody else without a disability would also play who's interested in it, that would be fine. There were things like I remember when he was in his recorder concert and, they didn't want him on the stage because they were worried that he was going to blow his recorder and ruin it for everybody else. I'm like, he gets to be on that stage and he gets to learn, as much as he can learn. And we will explain to him that once you do the song that you have learned, then you just, hang out and enjoy the rest of the concert, or whatever. But you don't stop him because you don't know how much he's going to learn. You're just assuming he can't do it from the get-go. So all these supplementary aids and services and supports that are supposed to help you in the general education classroom, these are extracurricular school activities I'm talking about. This is part of the school day. And, it does make it complicated because, their staff may not be there after school. Maybe there's peer support that could be helpful, but they are supposed to be in the least restrictive environment for those activities as well.
Right. So somebody else had, as Michelle was saying, of course, what about like a movie club, but a child needs personal care support?
Well, and this is where you need to argue, like you might argue in a general education class, your child needs that kind of support. It's basically the same argument that IEP says LRE applies to extracurricular activities, and this is what the student needs to be able to access this. And I'm not saying this without understanding the obstacles you will face to try to do this. I understand that. I don't want to make it sound like, oh, this is a simple thing and you're not a good advocate if you can't do this. I mean, we're still facing systemic problems, and this is part of what TIES will hopefully be working on from the top down. And I do want to take a moment. I should have said this more at the beginning, but I wanted to just say some of the other work TIES is doing. Okay. That in addition to what I work on is the universal technical assistance part, creating materials that anybody can use in any state to try to push from the ground up for LRE for these students. But also TIES is working on intensive technical assistance and targeted technical assistance. So TIES has selected 2 states, Maryland 2 years ago and Washington last year, where they are working intensively with those states. They picked 2 districts, very different kinds of districts in Maryland, and one is 170,000 student suburban district. Another one is a more rural, smaller district. Within these districts, they picked 2 schools, and they're working intensively to create models of how do you do systems change, even with these very different types of situations, and what obstacles are they facing, how they overcome them. And through this intensive technical assistance, there will be lessons learned and resources created about how you do systems change across the states. There's also targeted technical assistance where states who are not one of these intensive TA states can apply to get some help on not as broad technical assistance, but on specific problems that they have identified as barriers to this work in their state. And then there's the universal technical assistance, which is a lot of what we're talking about right here. So I just wanted to get that in, that there is this systems change work going on at the same time, which will hopefully, as we're coming up from here, we can help get these states to come from here and meet in the middle, so that when you say my child needs personal care in order to go to the school dance or to access this or that, that there will be an understanding that this is something that needs to be provided.
Right. Thank you. We had another comment from Angela in Arizona. It's kind of a long one. It will cover up our faces here for a minute. But it says there are many kids in Arizona that don't qualify for the state alternative assessment. and have to take the regular assessment that is way over their heads. Our state uses a waiver, but can possibly lose federal funding if they don't get back to the 1%. How do we address this? I have already been to the state capitol to speak on this subject. My daughter's adaptive skills are too high. She has Down syndrome and randomly fills in bubbles on the test since it's over her head. She spends most of her day in general ed.
Okay, so the first thing to know is that this 1%, like I said earlier, is big enough, 10% of students with disabilities, to include so many students who should not take this assessment. So the fact that they're putting your daughter in there does not mean that you're saying your daughter can't take it. Maybe they're not applying the criteria for the alternate assessment properly. The second thing I will say is that I had my son take the regular assessment all the way through high school, in part because we didn't have some of this ESSA language. They would have taken him off diploma track in 3rd grade had I allowed that at that point. The fact that he didn't pass that assessment, the fact that he might have been, filling in some things randomly, the point of those assessments is to show whether students are meeting those standards. And what it'll show is that your daughter is not. And maybe they need to do some better instruction for students who are in between, the alternate assessment, or maybe they need to be universally designing their regular assessment so that it's more appropriate for the broad range of students who should take it. But you don't necessarily want to throw a lot more kids in the alternate assessment than should be for that reason, that they're catching the wrong students or that they're not doing their general assessment in a way that's appropriate for your child. And, the opt-out, I understand why a lot of parents want to opt out, but it hurts the data that we collect on how students are doing. And, we already have a problem, and this will be on Candace's website, with the rule that 95% of students with disabilities are supposed to take an assessment. And, there are a lot of states that just the kids, are taking field trips on those days, and then there's a big opt-out. But it hurts us from getting the data we need to show what's happening and where instruction and assessment aren't meeting up. But I think one of the big problems is that these regular assessments are not truly being universally designed in a way, and they need to do a better job on how they design their regular assessments.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And like you said, with Ty's work in making more systemic change, I think all of these kinds of concerns are going to be right there, right? I think people realize that that's something that needs to be tackled. And so it'll be interesting to see if testing companies start using more principles of universal design for learning when they're, actually developing these state tests.
And NCEO, the National Center for Education Outcomes, which is also a partner in the TIES project, has been working with states on how do you reduce these percentages while still getting the right students who should be taking the alternate assessment, and improving the academics for those who may be on the cusp. So there's work out there being done with states. Arizona is part of this TIES center. So, and they were part of the NCSIC as well. So they should know how to do a somewhat better job than perhaps they're doing.
So Angela,
I didn't want to make you dizzy there. I just kept
fine. So Angela, when our broadcast is done, I can come back and post some of those specific organizations that Ricki just mentioned. And that could be something that you share with, your school district or with the state to make sure that they really are using the best practices out there. And since Arizona has partnered with TIES and other groups, we should be looking at Arizona as being one of the models, right?
They should be, yes. So just to get a little more through this IEP document, so after talking about all the general LRE stuff, we discussed the different components of the IEP, tips on what could be done at using these parts of the IEP to support inclusive education, and then links to resources for each of these components. So, for example, there's present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. These should be strength-based, person-centered. Try to keep them away from that medical model of just what the students' deficits are, and don't let it limit the general education curriculum. As I said before, just because they say, oh, this student is on a first grade reading level and they're in sixth grade, that does not mean that they can't be in a class where they're reading Shakespeare, because there are adapted lower level texts, there are movies, there are, using UDL, there are all kinds of resources where they can get value out of this content and be there with their non-disabled peers. It doesn't rely on what is your reading level. There are all these modifications, adapted materials to help make up that difference. I gave you that example of working on geometry. So the present levels of performance shouldn't mean that, oh, you don't get the general ed curriculum. It may determine, where your starting point is, how much modifications you may need, the complexity, but, try to keep it as positive as possible. Goals should be standards-based, so they should be aligned to the general ed curriculum. And to the extent possible, they should be including references to same-age general education peers. So when we would have, for example, speech, turn-taking or initiating conversation goals, it would be with non-disabled peers in the goals. The goals for reading for speech can also be about articulating vocabulary words or reading aloud from a text that's being used in the classroom, or, references to the grade level text, with adaptations or whatever. So these are important, and there's a link in this brief to NCSIC had a brief. They had some briefs as part of that project, and there's a brief on standards-based IEPs. There's the services we talk about, the supplementary aids and services, the related services, so special education services and how they can be written to support inclusion. There's program modifications and personal supports for educators. So this is where, an aid can be in there. An aid can be under supplementary aids and services if needed. You don't want to have an aid just for your student if they don't need it. If there's other supports in the classroom that are enough for them, that would be great. But, some students that may be necessary and could maybe be faded as time goes on. You want to make sure, of course, they're not over in the corner working on second grade material in sixth grade with that aid, because then they might as well be in the special ed classroom. You want to think about training that you want to put in the IEP, like UDL training for educators or other training that might help them know how to do this work. There's a part in every IEP where they're supposed to say what the extent of non-participation in general education is, and this includes extracurricular activities and the rest. So they're supposed to say what extent they are not with their non-disabled peers and why. And that, that they should have to be pretty robust about the reasons why, and they shouldn't be including all these reasons we already talked about, or that we don't have the money to do this, or, because a lot of times it's not more expensive to do this. It's about thinking about how you spend your money at the district level. There are so many resources, like I said, that could be used for other students in the class that are not just for this student, that would benefit everybody. And I'm trying to think of some of the other ones. There's information about transition. There's about how you implement and measure progress on goals. These should be written as measuring them within the general education classroom and how that can be done. So, there are all kinds of tips and resources within here trying to hit on these different parts of the IEP and how you can use this part of the IEP to further bolster your argument, because the placement is supposed to be talked about at the end. You're supposed to have your IEP and what services and what your goals are, and then talk about where it can be implemented. And if you already have a bunch of goals in there that can really only be implemented in the general education classroom, you're already part of the way there. And again, I know this is not easy. You may hit a lot of resistance, but at least this is something you can wave around and say, this isn't just me. I was always treated as a crazy mama because it was me talking my ideas. I didn't have these resources to wave around. So I'm hoping that part of the benefit of these resources is to be able to say, look, this is a federally funded center. This brief came from there. This isn't just me saying this. This is, and I want to share this with you.
Right.
We also cover some other topics in this brief, providing resources for it that are relevant to IEPs, like accessible educational materials and resources on how you can find out information about that, about assistive technology, about communicative competence, because for a lot of students, the barrier is that they don't have verbal language or they are not intelligible in their verbal language. And so it's important that they get adequate communication supports. So TIES and other places have resources and toolkits on advocating for that. That was a suggestion as another brief that maybe we should do, is around advocating around communicative competence, and also IQ testing. IQ testing is always a big issue. Can they make me have my child IQ tested? I did a brief on that for the Intelligent Lives film, and there's a link to that in there about what IDA says and doesn't say around IQ testing. So that's part of this brief as well. So, like I say, I can't go into everything in this brief. There's a lot in there, but that is somewhat of an idea. And then if there's time, I will give you a little bit of an idea about the next brief. So I don't know if there are any questions.
Yeah, let's add a couple of questions. Jessica is here, and she says, how do you suggest adding the intangible benefits of inclusive education into an IEP?
So I'm not exactly sure what you mean by intangible benefits, if you're referring to social benefits or, improved communication or...
Right.
I'm not quite sure exactly what you're meaning, but within those goals, we know IEPs cover academics, and I want to say, this is a good place to say it, that the IEP is not the student's curriculum. The IEP are the goals they need in order to access the full curriculum. They still get social studies, they still get science, because sometimes IEPs focus on math and reading, and then educators think that's all there is. But these intangibles can be addressed through supports for the extracurricular activities, for social goals, for communication goals, and those can help build social skills, because you're talking about having conversations, things that are sometimes hard, and cause students with disabilities not to be happy in their regular education class because they find it hard to get into the conversations with their peers. So working on that can be a way to facilitate friendships and lunch bunches or other things, circle of friends can be a way. So I don't know if I answered the question because I'm not quite sure what the reference to. But.
Right. Yeah. No, that was good. And Courtney had a question, I think maybe an idea for a future brief. Courtney Hansen is an advocate in Washington, and she said, are there any statistics on how many students with significant cognitive disabilities are on a regular diploma track? Ricki, will you be writing a brief on how to keep kids like this on a diploma track?
So the data that's collected by the states and the federal government is based on the IDA categories. It's based on students with disabilities in general, and then it's broken down more under IDA categories. So there is no data collection specifically around kids who take alternate assessments. I think that, hopefully the ESSA provision that they are not to be precluded from taking an alternate assessment will help with that. It's something I can ask NCO, will they be looking specifically, and I don't know all their resources, so I might, if Candace knows, she can type in an answer here, but they might have a resource on that. I'm not sure, but I can inquire with them. If they don't, will they be looking at that? And a lot of these other briefs are addressing that because, let me talk about the fourth brief a little bit if there's not a lot of.
Right, yeah, sure.
Because this will hit on this somewhat. I mean, in order to get the regular diploma, you know, different states, I know there are resources on what states require for regular diploma, and some states have alternate different tracks for regular diplomas, and you can substitute classes, and there are different credit requirements. In some states, like my own, there's only one diploma, there's no other diploma, and if you don't pass the high school assessments, there's a bridge project, but that's about that. And so about how you stay on diploma track is to be in the grade level curriculum and to go as far in that curriculum as you can. And so they can tell you your child may not get a diploma because they're getting so many modifications that they may not be able to get there by the time it comes to graduate, but they can't just preclude you from trying. So the fourth brief we're working on right now is about general education curriculum, not alternate curriculum. Because if they're using a lockstep alternate curriculum that they're using for all kids to take the alternate assessment, and educators who are working with these students go over there and they get a training and they don't get trained on the general ed curriculum, the chances of your child staying on diploma track are very weak, because the people who are educating or helping modify are not learning about the general education curriculum.
Right.
We're not collaborating with the general educators. So in this brief, we will go through the law and what it says about, doesn't say a thing about alternate curriculum, only talks about general education curriculum, including for these students. We will talk about when there can be curriculum resources like the NCSIC ones that provide examples and help educators figure out, you know, what they can do to modify. But once those become a lockstep thing that you do for all kids and you're not letting the students go as far as they can go, then it becomes an alternate curriculum. So, you know, there's a thin line between grade level lines. Some states have these curriculum and they say they're grade level lines. And that's great if they are, but if they're being used the same for every kid, regardless of what their modification accommodations needs are, excuse me, then that's an alternate curriculum. So making sure that they're working on the general education curriculum, going as far as they can go, knowing what those graduation requirements are, knowing what are the core pieces to move from grade to grade. I mean, I would say to the teachers, there are so many objectives in this fourth grade curriculum, but I don't remember half of this, you know. I mean, so he doesn't need to know every general, you know, in this war. He doesn't need to know collectivism. He doesn't need to know this or that. What are the 20, for example, core essential learnings? And this is part of those element cards I was talking about. What are the essential learnings that he really needs to get so that when he's learning history in fourth grade, that he'll learn what he needs to learn then to go to the next level of history? And it's not all window dressing.
Right.
You know, it's one of the things that and it's not what Steve needs to know. They would say, well, we don't know what Steve needs to know. I'm like, it's not what Steve needs to know. It's what would any student in your class, if they could only learn 20 things out of this unit, and I'm just pulling 20 out of a hat.
Right.
What would they be?
Well, I know, you know, when Dylan was in sixth grade, they did a unit on Egypt, and it was like, so as a parent, I was like, so what do I remember about Egypt? You know, I know there's mummies. I know they built these tombs. There's pyramids. There's that Nile River. So, yeah, I mean, just that familiarity. But I think the other part is to, before the unit starts, both the parent and the teachers talk about what those essential, you know, concepts are. And then you have a way to make sure that you assess if the student learned those in a variety of ways.
And that's what we would put in the IEP. We would put in unit objectives that he would focus on. And not to say he couldn't learn more than that. Right. You know, and if they were doing a class project, he might focus on those things more than other things, but he still had to be part of the group project and not just hold up the poster. You know, he had to be a meaningful part of it. But what are really the core things that he needs to learn? And then these are the things that you should be assessing him on and grading him on. And there is going to, TIES is going to put out something about grading, because grading is
Oh, good.
a tough topic. I know they're going to work on that. So I don't know if I totally answered Courtney's question, and I will bring up to them, are they considering that topic? But I think a lot of it, it's very state dependent, because the rules in the states and sometimes even districts have different diploma requirements. It's going to be different what you need to do in order to get that diploma. But remember, you've got extra years in order to meet those requirements, and that you should be, no child is guaranteed to earn the diploma, but ESSA says every student has a right to work towards that diploma and not be precluded from attempting to complete those requirements. So knowing what they are, thinking ahead, knowing when they change, because they do change, and trying to make sure that people are thinking about not just giving a list of things to your student to learn that are not going to really help them as much. I mean, if they don't know who Roosevelt and Churchill is, but they know who some guy that was shot down in a fighter pilot over the war, that's not going to really help them as much. If they can learn more, of those people, more of those places, more of those battles, more power to them. But what are those things that they really need to carry on to build on in later grades? I mean, there should be a pyramid, what everybody needs to learn.
Right.
And then, going up to the enrichment piece for students who need to know, need more even than what most people learn.
Right. Well, we're at the top of the hour. This has been so interesting, and I just love all the different topics that we've discussed. I think we'll end on a couple questions we have here, because I know both Ricki and I are passionate about universal design for learning. So we have a couple of questions that are real similar as far as, what is good UDL training to request for teachers and paras and other staff? And then Kelly also asked, where do teachers get the UDL training? Are there resources we can point them to?
Well, CAST on its website, cast.org, has a lot of resources, UDL modules, things that are free that educators can go on to learn more about it. CAST also has summer institutes, if you can get your teacher to get over to Massachusetts. A lot of the states in their ESSA plans said they were implementing UDL because the Department of Ed made it, through advocacy, we got in there that UDL would be an important thing to see in those ESSA plans. And a lot of states said that they were doing things around UDL. I look at your State Department website, see what they say about UDL. There are states that have state trainings on UDL that could be a possibility, and just looking online in general. But I know there are things in CAST. CAST has CAST, and also there's the UDL IRN, which you can look up through your search engine. UDL IRN is Implementation and Research Network. Both CAST and the UDL IRN have people that you can bring to your state and do a presentation. I mean, I did that before my state was doing anything in UDL, brought someone in to do a presentation in my district. Maryland actually had a UDL task force, and we passed UDL regulations that have helped move things along a little bit. There's a document called A Route for Every Learner that came out of this Maryland UDL task force that you can find.
And the Iris Center also has some modules on UDL, and I'll put those resources in. And like I said, if you type in the word, type in the word TIES, and then what I'm going to be doing is putting together a variety of resources that Ricki has been mentioning today. So then I'll email that out to everybody Tuesday, and that will give you some direct links, but also we'll put some of the links in the comments here too, so you'll be able to get those. Well, Ricki, you are just like a wealth of information, right? We could have you here every week and capture your insights and your wisdom. But I so appreciate you taking time to be with us today, and with all our live viewers and people that are watching the replay, know that you can still come in and make comments and ask questions, and I'll circle back. But I also want to let our viewers know that next week is the first Thursday in March, and that's when we do our Q&A session. So any questions, bring those with you next Thursday. The following Thursday, Beth Tolley, who works with the Alliance Against Restraint and Seclusion, is going to be our guest, and she's going to be talking about the problem with behaviorism. And so that's going to be a hot topic that I know people will be intrigued with. So Ricki, do you have any closing words for us before we sign off here?
I guess, again, encouragement to go to that TIE Center website, to look under all the different tabs at the resources, to also to like them on Facebook so you can get more up-to-date information, and also like NDSC and NDSC Policy and Advocacy page. And we sign up for our news lines, because we send out information on these topics and many more that would be of interest to you, I think. So.
And so I think this is the best contact information for you, or if they want to email you, Ricki, is that correct?
Yes, that's a way to contact me, yes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you once again. And, I always learn from others, and it's a privilege that we can have somebody of Ricki's experience and knowledge to be with us. And Ricki, we just appreciate your work and the work of all the staff at the National Down Syndrome Congress, and the way that you constantly are standing up and advocating for our students. So thank you so much, and thank all our viewers, and we shall see you next week, Thursday at noon Mountain Time. I'm Charmaine Tanner, and take care.
Thank you, Charmaine.
Thanks.